Everyone, and welcome to my podcast. My anthropology class. Today we're going to be talking about adaptationist perspectives on human evolution. We will get into what exactly adaptationist perspectives are, but just as an advanced warning, if you hear something that sounds like a scream in the background, it's not a human. It's a cat that's really mad that it can't be in the room with me. Anyway. Okay, so the assigned reading for this week was the Gould and Lewontin reading, which we'll get to in a minute. I know that it can be a little bit dense for people in some cases, so we're going to go through the Gould and Lewontin argument in quite a bit of detail momentarily. But first, I want to go over some quick definitions and review of adaptive traits and natural selection. Okay, so we'll start with this question: what is an adaptation? An adaptation, aka an adaptive trait. An adaptation is first and foremost a process rather than a part of the body. So we can see the results of adaptation when we look at certain types of traits, but it's kind of a tricky little distinction there. So an adaptive trait is a trait with a current functional role in the life of an organism that's maintained and evolved by means of natural selection. Adaptations serve to enhance the fitness and survival of individuals. Now, there are three different types of adaptive traits, as you can see on the slide here: structural, behavioral, and physiological. So structural adaptations are physical features on an organism, such as the shape, the body covering, the coloring, etc. Things that are physically present in the phenotype of the individual. Behavioral adaptations or behavioral adaptive traits are inherited behaviors or behavior chains, or the ability to learn, things like that. Inherited behaviors like instincts in kind of other animals, and the capacity for learning in humans and other primates, such as the ability to search for food or mates or vocalizations, that kind of thing. So these are behaviors that have some foundation in the genetics of the animal. The physiological adaptive traits permit the organism to perform special functions, such as making venom, for example, but also for more general functions like growth and development, temperature regulation, that kind of stuff. Okay, so adaptation does, of course, affect all aspects of the life of an organism. Now, just a brief kind of recapping of natural selection. For this class, I'm not going to go into a detailed discussion of modern evolutionary theory, but I am actually going to post links to my lectures on the subject from my Anth 1020 class. So if you need a refresher on any of that, you can watch those lectures, but I'm not going to cover it here for this. Okay, so just really quickly, natural selection, of course, is the differential survival and reproduction of individuals due to differences in phenotype. So it's the key mechanism of evolution, and what we see is a change in heritable traits of a population over time. Now, the way that it works, of course, is that you have genetic variation, like a totally normal level of genetic variation within a population. The ultimate source of that variation in the population at the genetic level is going to be random mutations. We also, in animals that engage in sexual reproduction, have recombination. So both of those things kind of work together to produce genetic variation within a species. Of course, that genetic variation can then be inherited. We have some individuals, of course, having beneficial adaptations or beneficial traits that are more likely to increase their reproductive success. If their reproductive success or reproductive fitness is increased, then of course those genes will become more widespread in the population. So over time, this process leads to a change in gene frequency. That's all evolution is, of course. It's just changes in allele or gene frequencies over time. These changes in frequencies accumulate over long periods of time, or in some cases short periods of time, and lead to pretty large-scale phenotypic changes. Those would be physical changes. Microevolution at the genetic level, which is just the fact that we have these changing allele frequencies over time. That's the term that we use for that at the genetic level, microevolution. Macroevolution then refers to the more widespread changes at the population level. So we're looking at basically the same things, just differences in terms of scale. The picture on the slide here, of course, probably all of you are familiar with this, especially if you've taken my 1020 class. The pictures here are, of course, of peppered moths. If you aren't familiar with the peppered moth case, you can go back and look at the lectures that I will post from my other class if you want to refresh your memory, but it's a well-documented case of natural selection in action. Okay, so selection on traits can be either positive or negative. So the trait in question can be beneficial to the organism, meaning that it increases reproductive success, or it can be negative. It can be a deleterious effect that the allele has. In the case of deleterious genes, then of course you would have a reduction in the frequencies of those genes over time because it would obviously impact the reproductive success of the individual. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about adaptationist perspectives. This is what the whole Gould and Lewontin article is about. So what exactly is an adaptationist perspective? So an adaptationist perspective is the view that many physical and psychological traits of an organism are evolved adaptations. So it's the idea that we can look at an organism and we can look at all of its structural traits, behavioral traits, and physiological traits, and we can come up with ideas for how all of those traits are adaptations. How did they evolve? Why did they evolve from a natural selection standpoint? So someone who falls into this adaptationist mindset, this adaptationist perspective, is going to perform research by trying to distinguish adaptations from byproducts or random variation. So again, they would be looking at natural selection and traits of organisms from the lens of what kind of natural selection process led to that trait. So the question, of course, is how do you decide if physiological structure is adaptive? So there might be a physiological structure that an animal has that is not adaptive. There are lots of potential explanations for some features that don't involve adaptationist arguments. So the example that I like to use when I'm talking about this question is the presence of a belly button on a human. So the adaptation, if we were looking at the adaptationist perspective for explaining why belly buttons exist, what we would of course come up with if we understand fetal development is that it has to do with the presence of an umbilical cord in utero. Of course, the removal of the umbilical cord is what ultimately causes the physical appearance of a belly button. So the adaptation itself is the presence of an umbilical cord. Now, the belly button, how it appears on your own body, that is a byproduct of the adaptation. So the belly button itself doesn't serve a function. The belly button is a byproduct of this kind of previous feature that played a really important role. So the belly button itself is a byproduct. Now, we can also look for examples of random variation for those traits. So going back to the example of the belly button and umbilical cord, an example of random variation would be, does a person have a convex or a concave belly button? So do they have an innie or an outie? So again, in that example, the adaptation is the presence of the umbilical cord. The byproduct is the presence of a belly button, and the random variation in the population is going to be convex or concave. Okay, so let's talk about the Gould and Lewontin article. I know that this article can be a little bit difficult to get through for some people, so I want to kind of go through step by step and talk a little bit about the background for the Gould and Lewontin article and what kind of point they're trying to make. Okay, so a little bit about the authors first. Stephen Jay Gould was a very famous and influential paleontologist, kind of public intellectual figure. I believe he died in the 90s, I want to say. I'm not really sure. The article itself was written in 1979. Richard Lewontin was also a very well-respected scientist. He was actually a population geneticist. Okay, so we talked about what adaptationist perspectives are. Basically, they are the mindset where you're trying to study organisms from this adaptationist standpoint. So again, we're looking at the organism's anatomy or behavior, for that matter, from the perspective of natural selection. So you're always, if you're kind of in this mindset, you're always looking for how anatomy could possibly have been adaptive in the past. So the reason why we're reading this article is because for the rest of the semester, we're going to be studying human adaptation from different angles. Specifically, of course, focusing on behavior, but it's important to kind of get our minds in the right place going into this. Okay, so in terms of like morphological adaptations, an adaptationist perspective would be how did we end up looking the way we do and being as smart as we are from an evolutionary standpoint. For behavioral adaptations, the question you might ask is why do we behave the way that we do? And this is, of course, the question that we're going to focus on throughout the rest of the semester. So the question would be, are there evolutionary explanations for human behavior? One caveat that we will come back to many times over the course of the semester is the question of whether it's even appropriate to apply evolutionary thinking to human behavior. So we'll get into the kind of sticky aspects of that as we go along. So basically, before we get into these adaptationist approaches to studying humans, I wanted to discuss adaptationist thinking in general and possible pitfalls and failures of that thought process. So Gould and Lewontin's article is basically a critique of this perspective. It's a critique of the adaptationist perspective. The title of the paper, of course, is The Spandrels of San Marco and the Panglossian Paradigm, a critique of the adaptationist program. So that's obviously kind of a mouthful for a paper. Just some quick vocabulary. In the title, of course, it says The Spandrels of San Marco. A spandrel is an architectural feature. I have a picture of a spandrel here in the center of the slide. A spandrel is basically a space between two arches or between an arch and a rectangular enclosure. So you can see like there's this arch here, and then the spandrel is part of what creates the arch. Basically, a spandrel is an architectural byproduct of the creation of the arch. Now, San Marco, this church pictured here, is a basilica in Venice that is very famous for its decorated spandrels. And this picture here is actually an image of one of the spandrels in the San Marco Basilica. So we'll leave that there for just one second. Jumping over to this other term that you might not be familiar with, the Panglossian paradigm. The term Panglossian is a reference to the French satirical work Candide by Voltaire. Now, in Candide, there is a character named Dr. Pangloss. This character in the book is kind of a clueless scholar who, despite all evidence, insists that, quote, all is for the best in this best of all possible worlds. So basically, he's just like an overwhelmingly positive optimist to the extent that it's kind of unrealistic. So this character of Dr. Pangloss is basically representing a philosophical idea that the present moment is an optimum state. So it's basically a form of philosophical optimism. So everything is made for its best purpose. So the way that Gould and Lewontin apply this idea is that they basically criticize the adaptationist view as basically indicating that every feature that we see on every animal that exists is an example of a feature that's optimized by natural selection. So it's this idea that every version of an animal that you see is perfectly or ideally adapted to the environment. So as a spoiler alert, what Gould and Lewontin are going to argue is that this is an unrealistic view of nature. Okay, So another term that comes up in the article is the term just so stories. So in science and philosophy, the term just so story is used kind of as a pejorative, as a negative, to refer to an ad hoc fallacy. So it's a kind of invalid reasoning, and it's a criticism. So basically what a just so story is that it's an unverified narrative explanation for a biological trait. So the phrase was actually popularized by Rudyard Kipling, who wrote a book, a collection of stories for children called Just So Stories. In this book, basically, Rudyard Kipling provides these kind of wild explanations for why animals look the way that they do. So pictured on the front cover of the book, of course, is one of his examples, an elephant trunk being stretched out by crocodiles biting and pulling on it. So it's, again, a reference to kind of illogical thinking. Now, how does this apply to biology? So Gould and Lewontin argue that the adaptationists have overemphasized the power of natural selection. So they believe basically that natural selection doesn't quite have the power that is kind of attributed to it to shape individual traits to some kind of optimal state. Now, the reason that they use the spandrels analogy is basically they argue that we can look at the spandrel and use it as an analogy for this flawed reasoning in biology. So if you were to go to the San Marco Basilica and you were to look at these spandrels and you didn't know anything about architecture or physics or engineering and you just looked at the decorations, you might be tempted to think that the arches had been created as a means of providing spaces for these beautiful carved reliefs. So while in reality, the spandrels are a byproduct of the creation of the arch, which is an engineering necessity in these large churches, these decorations are merely a byproduct of this engineering necessity. So if we were looking at these arches and we were thinking, well, this whole church has been designed the way that it is so that we could provide these little spaces to carve these beautiful reliefs. Well, that's an incorrect way of looking at why these spandrels exist. So basically what they are arguing is that what we sometimes assume is an adaptation is actually, in a lot of cases, a byproduct. So another example from human anatomy that I like to use, it might be a little clearer than this whole spandrels issue, is glasses. So if we know nothing about human evolution or biology or respiration or facial anatomy or anything like that, if aliens came to the planet and were looking at humans walking around with glasses on their nose, they might be tempted to interpret the projecting human nose as being an adaptation to being able to wear glasses. So in other words, they might misinterpret the facts to assume that natural selection produced this nice, handy surface to hold glasses on. In reality, of course, glasses design and placement is a byproduct of our respiratory apparatus. So again, what I really want you to take home from this article is that we have to be careful when we're looking at structures as they exist, or in the case, in kind of more relevant to this class, if we're looking at behaviors in humans, we have to make sure that we are being really careful about assigning these kind of adaptationist arguments. Now, if you have heard of evolutionary psychology, then there's kind of a relevant connection there. If you haven't heard of evolutionary psychology, that's okay. We're going to talk about it later in the semester. But evolutionary psychology has been kind of criticized because it seems to be kind of an adaptationist pursuit. So all of human behavior, it seems like people that practice evolutionary psychology try to explain everything that humans do in terms of evolution, and it might just not be possible. So again, we'll talk a lot more about evolutionary psychology later in the semester. Okay, so again, take-home message from this article. is that the adaptationist perspective puts too much importance on natural selection as the driver of everything. So they argue that coming up with these adaptive explanations automatically assumes everything must be an adaptation. They also argue, of course, that this ignores the fact that structures could be byproducts of other factors. This adaptationist perspective also discounts things like gene flow and genetic drift, which are other forces of evolution that can sometimes play important roles. Okay, so this is a really famous paper and it makes a lot of good points, but I don't want to give the impression that adaptationist thinking is always a bad thing. What I'm really trying to get across is that we have to be careful when we're using adaptationist perspectives. We can't just assume, especially if we're talking about human behavior, that everything has a direct evolutionary reason. There are certain patterns of human behavior that do seem to have a heavy kind of founding in natural selection, but we will discuss a lot as we go along through this semester how we have to be careful when we talk about that kind of thing. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about a case study. This is going to be a discussion of explanations for the rates of chronic illness in the U.S. So I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of proposed explanations for the rates of chronic illness in the U.S., and then we'll talk a little bit about how some of these explanations are adaptationists and some of them are not. Okay, so question, why do we see such high rates of chronic illness in the Western world? When I say chronic illness, of course, I'm talking about those, some of the things listed here. Diabetes is one of them, heart disease, of course, those types of things. Okay, so studies have shown that about 29% of adults in this country are categorized as obese by their BMI. Another 35% are overweight. So those are the CDC's numbers from 2014. So a few years old, things have probably actually gotten worse since 2014. So basically what we see is skyrocketing rates of chronic disease, including heart disease and diabetes. Diabetes, currently about 1/3 of the people in the U.S. will develop type 2 diabetes at some point in their life. What used to be viewed as adult onset diabetes is now appearing more and more in adolescents and children. 30 million adults in the U.S. have diabetes and about 86 million have prediabetes. In terms of cardiovascular disease or heart disease, it is, of course, the leading cause of death in the U.S. for men and women. More than a quarter of deaths in the U.S. Across the board, across ethnic groups, are related to cardiovascular disease. In terms of the economic impact, heart disease costs the U.S. about $207 billion a year in healthcare. Now, these disorders are associated, of course, with overweight and obesity, also with diabetes, poor diet, physical inactivity, and excessive alcohol use. So why do we see these rates? Obviously, our lifestyles are not great in this country. On average, we eat a poor diet and we do not exercise enough. But the question is, what actual mechanism is causing this? Is there some evolutionary reason why we're prone as a species to these conditions? So there's been a lot of research done kind of looking at this question from an evolutionary standpoint. So across the board, most of the explanations have something to do with the concept of mismatch. So the concept of mismatch is something that is really discussed a lot in the field of evolutionary medicine. Mismatch basically is the idea that a lot of the health issues that we face in the modern world are the result of the rapid shift from an ancestral hunter-gatherer lifestyle to modern life. So we eat vastly different foods, less healthful foods. We have very different activity patterns, meaning we don't get nearly enough activity. So most of these hypotheses, pretty much all of these hypotheses that we are going to talk about come back to this concept of mismatch. So if you're wondering, before the agricultural revolution, most of our time was spent acquiring food. So foraging and hunting, pretty much. The diets of hunter-gatherers vary pretty widely across the planet. It really depends on the type of environment that the group is living in. But some general trends that hold across the globe include a diet that's rich in fiber, low in fat, and has kind of a medium amount of animal protein. So basically what we're looking at is a typical omnivorous primate diet. Those of you who have taken 1020 will know primates are omnivorous in their diet patterns, and that includes humans. There's also, of course, lots of activity related to finding that food. Now, after the agricultural revolution, we have a dramatic reversal. So the variety in the diet drops. If you think about it, if you go to the grocery store, there's a ton of different kinds of foods. You might think, oh, there's a lot of variety in diets today. Actually, if you think about it, if you are shopping kind of the middle of the grocery store where the processed foods are, basically everything is made out of corn, soy, wheat. It's just a small collection of kind of base foods that are used to create a lot of the different things you see in the grocery store. So variety in the diet has dramatically decreased. Activity patterns have dramatically decreased as well. Of course, especially in the last 100 or so years when people kind of stopped doing subsistence farming and moved to the cities. So basically, we have these very dramatic changes in diets and in activity levels over the past 10,000 years. Now, from an evolutionary standpoint, 10,000 years is a drop in the bucket. So basically what these models are holding is that the environment that we evolved in, that we evolved to be evolutionarily suited to, no longer exists. We don't live in that environment anymore. So we have three models that are a little bit different from each other that all kind of come back to this idea of mismatch. So the thrifty genotype hypothesis, if you'll remember your terminology, the genotype means the genetic kind of underlying genetic information. So the thrifty genotype hypothesis is an adaptationist hypothesis. So basically, here's how it goes. It relies on inferences about our past life ways before agriculture. So it assumes that we lived very active lifestyles where most of our time was spent looking for food. We have periods of feast and famine that are interspersed. The hypothesis is also included that our bodies are physiologically adapted to this lifestyle, and that we're still adapted to this lifestyle, only we no longer live in it. So our evolution has led us to be kind of well suited to a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, and we're kind of taken out of that environment and experienced a very different food and activity levels now. Now, basically, we're not going to go into a lot more about this idea, except to say that our bodies evolved in this hypothesis. Our bodies evolved to hold on to calories. So basically, that's why it's so hard for us to lose weight, especially women. We have this evolutionary background, which leads us to being prone to gaining weight easily and holding on to that weight. So going back to this idea of feast and famine, from an evolutionary standpoint, if you live through periods of feast and famine, it makes sense to be able to put on weight as quickly as possible during a period of feast so that you have all of that extra body fat when a famine comes around. So basically, again, what we're talking about here is an adaptationist hypothesis, where the way that our bodies function physiologically today evolved long enough back in time in very different environments. And basically, this is what's causing all of these health problems today. So that is the thrifty genotype. Again, thrifty meaning we have these kind of genes that make us want to hold on to body fat. The drifty gene hypothesis is kind of a contrasting idea, and it's not an adaptationist explanation. So this idea is basically that in ancestral populations, you have these fat storage genes that accumulate variation across the globe because of genetic drift. Now, genetic drift occurs when some mutant alleles are not under selection at all. They're selectively neutral, but they spread throughout a population randomly, basically. So essentially what this model, this drifty genotype model, is proposing is that in the past, these mutations that allow us to gain weight easily, or, to have these insulin spikes that kind of control fat deposition, those traits tended to be neutral during our evolutionary history. And they haven't become detrimental until we live in this modern society with lots of, bad food choices and low levels of activity. So that is one. Again, this drifty genotype is not an adaptationist explanation. I included it as a contrast. So as a contrast to this thrifty genotype, which is an adaptationist argument. Okay, so the last one, the thrifty phenotype hypothesis, is basically that we have flexibility. We evolved as a species to have flexibility. Basically, this is kind of verging on an adaptationist hypothesis, but we're not quite getting there. The thrifty phenotype basically holds that our bodies can adjust in utero and throughout our lives, and then we can pass those genes on to our offspring. So it's, again, not an adaptationist argument exactly, but it still has kind of this underlying rationale involving evolutionary change leading to us having these flexible body types. Okay, the last thing that I will talk about here is that I wanted to reiterate that though this article is really famous, not everyone agrees with it. So there's been plenty of debate over the last 50 years or however long, 40 or 50 years, about this idea. So I'm not making you read this article. I'm not having you read this article, but Ernst Mayr is a very famous evolutionary biologist that took exception to this critique of Gould and Lewontin. So they wrote a response to Gould and Lewontin's argument. So Mayr agrees that the adaptationist program or adaptationist logic can be problematic, but he offers a more kind of a more multifaceted kind of exploration of using these kinds of ideas. So basically what he says is that we have to approach these questions very carefully. So we shouldn't be practicing what he calls atomistic approaches. An atomistic approach is basically means that you would break down the organism into smaller and smaller traits, and you try to come up with individual explanations for all of them. So he says that that's the wrong way to practice adaptationism. What he argues is that you should be looking for kind of the totality of all the traits. So how reproductively successful is the organism with all of these traits kind of included in your analysis. So again, basically what he's arguing is that this definition that Gould and Lewontin are using is kind of a reductionist definition. Now, an example that he uses is talking about bipedalism. So if we look at the picture here, we can see an ape skeleton, a quadrupedal ape skeleton, and a modern human biped skeleton. Now, again, if you've taken the 1020 class, and most of you have, you will, of course, know quite a bit more than what I'm going to talk about here in terms of how bipedalism emerged. But you'll hopefully remember that there are lots of structural changes that occur to allow for bipedal locomotion. So in Mayr's kind of argument, what he says is that there are lots of small individual traits that change in an organism who is evolving from quadrupedalism to bipedalism. So we can't just look at the shape of the pelvis. Just looking at the shape of the pelvis is not going to be helpful. We have to look at the totality of all of the physical changes that have happened over time. We have to look at the pelvis, the orientation and angle of the femora, the appearance and morphology of the feet, losing the opposable big toe, the arms getting shorter, the spine changing shape, all of the changes that come along with the cranium. So we can't just pick and choose which traits we're going to look at and examine them from an adaptationist standpoint. We have to examine kind of this whole structure and how all of these features are working together. So basically, what he's arguing is that Gould and Lewontin are a little bit too picky. What he argues is that you can use adaptationist approaches, but you also have to kind of use a more nuanced approach than the one described in the Gould and Lewontin article. So basically what he is arguing is that there's really nothing wrong with the adaptationist approach as it's practiced by most evolutionary biologists. What he argues is that Gould and Lewontin kind of created a straw man to be able to tear down. So just kind of a critique on Gould and Lewontin's critique. As I said, this is important moving forward into the rest of the semester because a lot of what we're going to be talking about is using adaptationist approaches to studying human behavior. And I just want to I want you to keep this in mind as we're going through kind of these contrasting ideas that Mayer and Gould and Lewontin had. And of course, I'll be kind of bringing this back up throughout the semester. Okay, so this is going to be it for the Adaptationist Perspectives lecture. As I said, I will be posting videos for my 1020 class for anyone who wants a refresher on evolutionary theory. If you feel comfortable with your knowledge on the subject, you don't have to watch them, but I did want to provide them for anybody who needs a little bit of review. Okay, bye guys.